The movie begins as Cairo Sweet, an 18-year-old girl, narrates what it is to be an adult. She lives alone in her house because her parents, who are lawyers, are permanently abroad. She talks about how she finds an escape in writing and longs to be loved and not feel lonely. She mentions meeting a teacher who is also a writer. Cairo walks into class where Jonathan Miller, a literature teacher, is already in, even though the class won't start for another hour. She tells him that she lives in Level Hill, and he is very amazed. He gives her a list of books they will be going through in class, and she tells him she read them all, which amazes him even more. Soon, her friend Winnie joins them, and we learn that this is her second time attending this class. Her stomach growls, and she goes out with Cairo to get some food. After they leave, Jonathan checks out the books Cairo brought to class. His friend and colleague Boris comes in and asks what he was reading. The book Jonathan was holding is an erotic fiction, and Boris takes it before he starts reading it out loud. Jonathan takes the book and goes over to eat the biscuits that Boris made. Boris finds Jonathan's book from Cairo and tells him she's the only one who checked it out.
Back at their house, Beatrice is buried in her work as Jonathan tries to get her attention. He tells her about Cairo and the kind of book she reads. He also lets her know that she has checked out his book from the library. But Beatrice mocks him. She gets a call from Amy, and Jonathan leaves to play some music as she gets angry over the phone. They share a drink, and Jonathan starts reciting lines from a book called Under the Roofs of Paris. He kisses her as they start dancing and making out, but Beatrice's phone rings, and she has to leave. Boris complains about having a terrible weekend as he and Jonathan sit on the court. They look over to the woods, and Boris tells him that there could be ghosts in there, and that the plants feed on the souls of the dead. Cairo walks out of the woods and greets them. Both of them keep asking her questions, and Boris offers her some biscuits before he leaves, mocking Jonathan. Jonathan asks if she doesn't get scared walking through the woods by herself, but she tells him she's the scariest thing in there. As Boris walks into the hallway, Winnie stops him and starts teasing him. He stops and talks to her as she tells him she wants to be in his class, and he can tutor her. Cairo watches them converse from a corner. Winnie tells her that she is seducing Boris and asks, "Are you jealous?" in a sing-song voice. Winnie and Cairo are in Cairo's house while she is smoking. Winnie asks where her parents could be at this time, and Cairo tells her she doesn't know how long they'll be away. Winnie asks Cairo to let her dress her up, saying she can be both smart and hot. Cairo is writing an essay to get into Yale, but she can't answer a question that asks what her greatest achievement is. Winnie tries to help her, but they can't find the right answer. She finally tells her to experience something worth writing about. Cairo asks her if she's really going to sleep with Boris, and Winnie tells her she wants an older man to do it with since it will be her first time. Winnie tells Cairo that Jonathan looks at her differently from the other students, but Cairo says she couldn't believe it. In class, Cairo keeps looking at Jonathan. He then asks her to see him after school. Boris is in Jonathan's class asking about Beatrice and the book she's writing. He is invited for dinner, and Jonathan tells him to shower before he comes over. After Boris leaves the class, Jonathan turns on music and starts dancing. He finds Cairo giggling when he turns around. They sit by the couch, and Jonathan asks if she's been to the scroll sessions at Sally Bunny's, a poetry salon in a Victorian village. He tells her to go on the upcoming weekend. The reason he wanted to see her was to talk about the story she wrote about a reluctant spider. He recites some lines from the story before they continue talking about the spider. He tells her she is talented and offers her a jump start on the midterm by assigning her to write a short story in the style of her favorite author. He says it could help with her portfolio for Yale. Cairo tells Jonathan that she read his book and calls it grand and tragic romantic horror. She quotes lines from his book, and he tells her that it was the first thing he wrote, but he hasn't written anything recently since he got married and started teaching. Cairo challenges him, saying he isn't inspired anymore. Winnie joins them as they talk. Boris, Jonathan, and Beatrice go out for dinner, where Winnie is the waitress. Beatrice asks why their order hasn't been served yet, and Winnie offers them drinks. Boris and Winnie sneer at each other, and Winnie calls Jonathan a boring teacher, which makes Boris laugh. Jonathan tells Beatrice that Winnie is Cairo's friend before they discuss her. Beatrice tells Jonathan that he's better at teaching than writing, and that it isn't for him. Both tell him that it's not because he can't write, but because he stopped writing and chose to teach. Jonathan is offended. On Saturday, Cairo goes to the poetry place Jonathan suggested, hoping to find him there. Soon, Jonathan joins her. She asks if he knows all the people there and if what they're doing is like group therapy. A man named Elliot starts reciting a play and they all listen. After the play, Jonathan and Cairo are outside. He asks if she thought it was going to be bad and she giggles, saying yes. Boris and Jonathan are sitting in their usual spot when Cairo brings them coffee. Boris offers her a biscuit he made and she suggests he sell them to raise money for his team, offering to help with Jonathan at school. Jonathan gets a text from Beatrice suggesting they go on a trip for the weekend. Cairo and Winnie visit Jonathan's class and find him hurrying to leave. He tells them about the trip with his wife. Cairo asks him for approval on the author she chose for her midterm, and they talk briefly before he leaves. Winnie mocks Cairo for the way she talked to Jonathan, getting on his desk as Boris walks in. He overhears them and agrees with the biscuit idea, asking both to help. Winnie stops him, asks for his number, and playfully hides his phone in her chest before giving it back. Jonathan is waiting for Beatrice to finish work when he gets a call from Cairo. He happens to have her phone in his bag, and she asks him to drop it off at her place. When he arrives, it's raining. He asks Cairo to join him in the rain and they share a kiss. Later, Cairo sits at home, reminiscing, while Jonathan feels awkward at home with Beatrice. Beatrice apologizes for cancelling their trip because of work. Jonathan receives Cairo's midterm assignment and reads it outside. It's an intimate story seemingly about their relationship, which makes him uncomfortable. He pleases himself while reading the story. On Monday, Cairo waits for Jonathan in his class, but he greets her coldly. He tells her she needs to choose another author because her story is inappropriate. She explains that it's about them, but he insists she write a new story or he'll fail her. Cairo pleads with him to stop treating her like a stranger and tell her what he really means. Jonathan tells her to rewrite the story or face failure. He feels foolish and calls her a child. In response, Cairo insults his writing, calling him a nobody, impotent and mediocre, while crying. She walks out heartbroken, comparing the pain to a car crash. Cairo goes home, drinks and cries with Winnie by her side. Jonathan tells Beatrice about his conversation with Cairo and her inappropriate story. Beatrice eagerly asks to read it. After reading it, she makes Jonathan repeat how Cairo described him in the story. Meanwhile, Cairo asks Winnie to text Boris, pretending she's drunk. Jonathan recites lines from Cairo's story as Beatrice initiates intimacy. They are interrupted when Boris arrives. Winnie confides in Cairo, saying she wants Boris to like her and sleep with her. Cairo pushes her to text Boris again, teasing her about their relationship. Later, Cairo sends the midterm story to the school principal. Beatrice receives a call from the principal and hands it to Jonathan. Boris leaves abruptly, saying goodbye to Beatrice. Jonathan learns that the principal received Cairo's story and fears she might make allegations that could cost him his job. Beatrice asks if anything inappropriate happened between them, emphasizing the risks. The following days, Cairo doesn't show up to school, and Winnie looks sad. She asks Jonathan if he's seen her, but he coldly says no. Cairo and Jonathan are both questioned by the principal, Joyce. Cairo claims that they used to meet before, during, and after class to talk about literature. Jonathan defends their relationship as strictly professional, explaining how he returned her phone and cancelled his trip with Beatrice. He asserts that nothing inappropriate happened, but he feels helpless. Boris asks Jonathan if he's in love with Cairo, pointing out that he crossed a line. This leads to an argument and Boris leaves. Jonathan confesses to Beatrice that he's been suspended. The argument escalates, with Jonathan calling Beatrice an alcoholic, and she retorts by calling him boring. Winnie confronts Cairo, asking why she's targeting Jonathan. Cairo reveals that she plans to testify against him in front of the school board, because he betrayed her. Winnie is shocked but feels powerless when Cairo blackmails her with the photo they took together. Cairo tells her this is her greatest achievement. In the end, Jonathan loses his job. Boris and Winnie drift apart and Cairo walks alone, narrating how this experience has shaped her. She is now a hero,